Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not. Oh, hi there, and welcome to Better Than Not, the podcast that aims to capture shifting perspectives and thought-provoking ideas and conversation while asking the question, is anything what it seems? Based on my series, A Changing Frame of Reference, which you can read on the Substack app, and I hope you will, as it might give you some insight into what the podcast is all about. I also hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel, Better Than Not, so I can continue to bring you great guests like we have for you today. I'm your host, Doug Gardam, and today it's a pleasure to welcome back, first time in video, Dr. Sophie Redlin. Sophie, how are you?
I'm really well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back.
You'd have no idea that we were 8 hours time difference in this discussion. Sophie is a doctor. She's a GP. She's also a filmmaker, which we're probably going to talk a little bit about today, if not a lot. And she also has I'll say, a specialty or a particular interest in the mental health concerned with, I'll say, extreme expeditions, which no doubt I think we're going to talk a lot about simply because I've been watching this Alone series. I don't know whether you have this in the UK or not, but it's what I originally thought I would have no interest in. It's such a psychological. This is the show, Sophie, where they have 10 people and they put them in 10 separate places, and the person who can be alone the longest wins.
Got it. Yeah.
Which I don't think is healthy to start off with, but it is fascinating to see the psychological aspects of it. Anyway, that's a whole nother side in my introduction to you. You've also just recently completed your master's, which we talked about. You were doing your dissertation, I think, the last time we spoke. And this is in anthropology.
Yes, it's in medical anthropology. So looking at human behavior and health around the world and within our culture.
Oh, wow. So I'm going to dive right into your filmmaking because I think this part is very fascinating. So, what you've just completed a project, or you're in the middle of a project right now?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of a project that draws on my dissertation, actually. So draws on my master's. And I'm working with doctors exploring their experiences of patient death in training. And we're exploring the historical silence around those kind of encounters and why they impact people and how experiences of death change us as medics. And yeah, so it's really exciting. I'm interviewing people at the moment, looking at some archival footage, etc. And it's obviously a personal project for me because I have my own stories along those lines. So I'm really enjoying it.
So this is a person who is working in, I'll say, the first responder field or as a doctor, and a death occurs with the person that they're trying to, what a, trying to keep alive. Would that be the way that this is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea came from uh, doing my paper, my dissertation last year, and I was talking to fellow doctors about some of the experiences they've had in training, and a lot of experiences that they talked about featured death in some way. So that might be, for example, even doing dissection as a student, so anatomy, learning perhaps with a cadaver, so seeing their first dead body, or perhaps it was a death later on in their careers that was quite difficult, or not always negative. Potentially it was a death that felt very dignified and moving for them. And I was struck by, I guess, yeah, the universality. So the fact that we all have these
That's,
experiences. Don't
we're all
even know.
mortal.
And they're really important, but sadly something we don't talk a lot about. And so I was very drawn to giving people a space to share some of those stories and to reflect on how those experiences had shaped them as doctors and as people.
Well, I'm very quite intrigued by this because my son works as a paramedic.
Ah, okay.
And so he will I remember the first time he had to deal with, like, because they have to go and excuse me, deal with a person who's died. I won't say it's a regular thing, but it's certainly a part of the job. And I'm often intrigued by, like, so what kind of goes on, and it's part of his job. So it's like you kind of this is what your job is, right? So I don't know that you necessarily think about it in the same existential way that a person who's not part of that. Like, I'm thinking of a person who's at a funeral home, for instance, who that's all they deal with. And it's intriguing to me, like, what what brought you onto this subject? Like, was this through your GP practice, or is it connected with your interest in, I'll say, the extreme expeditions and what goes on in, like, which are life and death kind of expeditions, right?
Yeah, I suppose lots of things brought me onto the topic, but yeah, coming from the expedition field first, I probably talked last time about being interested in a term called moral injury. So
Right, right, right.
yeah, for those listeners who aren't familiar, it's basically the experience of encountering something that feels very morally challenging, and either witnessing that or being a part of it or not preventing something happening. And as an idea that originated in the military in very extreme circumstances, but increasingly we know that it's probably something that everyone experiences, who lives on the planet. And one could argue we're all experiencing that at the moment with the various things going on.
Sure.
Um, and so I've sort of entered that space from various angles, looking at doctors as one angle, but actually the expedition world is really interesting in that respect because people traveling to extreme environments and encountering both, uh, you know, high stake situations in terms of, being on top of a mountain or deep at sea, or potentially being within cultural settings that are very different to our own and witnessing things. I think it's probably quite a common experience that someone feels some degree of, certainly moral challenge, whether that it becomes anything else. And so, yes, as you say, I've been doing some work around, I guess, just raising awareness of that. And in terms of the film project, as I say, my writing last year was sort of swimming in those waters. And it seemed, not too surprisingly, that people's encounters, particularly with patient deaths, there seemed to be an element of that. It might have been, for example, that the person in question felt some way at fault. It may have been that they felt that the system had failed that person. And sadly, the same is true on expedition, so we're all aware, I think, expeditions where perhaps members have died or things have gone wrong. And I think how the team deals with that and then processes it when they get home is really important and something that's probably been a bit neglected in
Hmm.
conversation.
No, I was going to say I find very intriguing here is that, and I'll go back to the example I mentioned with my son. Part of that, I'll say, training, or going through that, is you find out quickly whether you can even do it. So it's like, because some people just cannot, I think, cannot deal with that, shall we say, death and dead bodies. They realize that that's not going to work for them when they're in that position. Whereas once he was involved with that, and he was like, I mean, we used to go, certainly not extreme expeditions, but we would go for like weeks on portaging trips, and he just thrived in the environment. It was just the kind of thing that he liked to do. And so that's always when he said he's the paramedic part sounded like, well, he's going to be able to deal with that too. But to your point, there's still the moral injury that would take place, whether you have defense mechanisms, things that are made part of you that are there. It doesn't take away the fact that you're still being part of it.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering, like, is that part of where you're kind of like, you could, in the sense, be morally injured and be unaware of what that is doing to you? I immediately think actually of the PTSD in soldiers. and some can come back and just deal with it, it seems, but they're seeing things that they'll say humans aren't supposed to see, as an example, right? And so
Yeah.
that's why I'm intrigued by how this is coming, and how you're working with this in your information, because you would be uncovering things that, well, you said at the beginning, people don't like to talk about.
No.
And it but it is this is much a part of our life, is coming into it.
Yeah, as you say, it's deeply uncomfortable for people. And I think that's part of the challenge, particularly in settings like the expedition world, because as I think we talked about before, there is still, I think, a narrative around being good enough.
Mm,
It's quite a traditionally, historically masculine world. Not so much anymore, but certainly used to be. And a little bit like medicine, interestingly, there's, yeah, sort of fear of failure, I think. It obviously can be really difficult if people set off to do something and then don't succeed. So I think really challenging some of those narratives is part of this conversation. And to be honest with you, I've got to the point where I don't really mind the discomfort anymore. I'm sort of a bit used to there being resistance to some of these
okay.
topics, because actually, as soon as you give people a little bit of space, as I'm finding in this film project, it's amazing actually how quickly people do open up. Because I think everybody's got a story like that, not necessarily, the death of a patient or even seeing a dead body or whatever, but some kind of encounter that left them feeling, oh, that didn't feel quite right.
Mm.
And so, and as I think we spoke about before, feeling like you can say that out loud and be recognized by someone is a really powerful thing.
Do you encounter in some of these discussions this, because in a sense, it's, I'll go back to even like sports, and like, um hockey is what we grew up with here. Like, you get body checked or you get slammed into the boards, you're hurt, like you're bruised, and the equipment wasn't then like it is today even, and you get your bell rings, so to speak. But it was seen as a weakness, Sophie, if you said, well, I'm hurt, like I can't, and out you go again. And in today's world, it's like concussion is taken very seriously, compared to, well, that's just a bump on the head, get back out in the ice, right? It, how do you see that in some of this when you're talking about it? Because to me, you mentioned the masculine, I'm thinking that manly, that mighty warrior, that kind of, um, I don't know, the Grizzly Adams kind of figure that you see. And again, it's only portrayed in a two-dimensional kind of sense. You don't get the inner thinkings of some of these characters. Does that play into some of this conversation that you're like, and trying to overcome that? Because I can see that being quite like, wow, like they're just weak, and they use stronger words than that for sure. But
Yeah, yeah, it does. And um, one of my sort of main findings of my dissertation last year was the tendency, which I've done myself, to purposefully sort of cut off from what I was feeling in certain events, which emotionally, I mean. And I think there's always an argument for that in some circumstances of, particularly for doctors, paramedics, soldiers out in the field, to be able to carry out a task and to, know, not get too much involved in how that feels in the moment. But where I think that argument immediately falls down is, well, what do you do with those emotions afterwards? Because they don't go anywhere. And I think that's when, as you say, people do learn to cope with it by numbing out or, using alcohol or whatever,
yeah, yeah.
traditionally people have done. So I think, yeah, to answer your question, that the silence is a big part of the conversation, but also the self-perpetuatingness of the silence, in that I found people were almost sort of self-policing, so I'm so afraid of
Mm,
being weak, as you say, that I'm not going to speak up about how this feels, which, is a result of the environment that they're in. So I don't say that critically, but it's amazing then how this cycle continues. And as I say, in certain settings, I think that's heightened. Um, but I just wanted to pick up really quickly on what you said a minute ago about the kind of warrior, because I think that's, you're right that I think this perspective, particularly for men, that they've had to live up to this idea of being quite, emotionally strong and not talking about these things is very two-dimensional. And actually, when I've spent time in some other cultures, I'm thinking particularly of Alaska Native people and
Hmm.
their concepts. Obviously, they have a very culturally defined concept of the warrior, which, is specific to them and might be very different for us. But what I found was really lovely there was that very much meant for them emotional strength as well, in terms of being open and being vulnerable. And so I guess I would say, yeah, we can show strength in all kinds of ways, and hopefully that's changing a little bit.
Well, I'm constantly kind of how do I say it? I'm intrigued by this because it's like you had mentioned there was, and I will go back even the last generation to a certain extent. It'll be they'll forget about it, like, and I think recently I just saw it in a movie, and it was like one family didn't want the other family son and daughter marrying, and we'll just they'll forget about it, and that's a pretty kind of simplified area, but it's like if something tragic happens, well, let's just go to Italy for a while and we'll forget about it. And what's becoming very apparent is our brains don't forget. Like everything that we see, whether we can block it out or not, it's still there. Do you encounter this like a lot? Like, do you have people like kind of denying that, well, we just forgot about it and we moved on? And it's like, well, you did now, but what's going to be there in 10 years or whenever it decides to surface in a sense? And you don't have, it doesn't seem we have control.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, firstly, I have found people have said that. I just put it in a box and I didn't think about it
Yes.
again. But I'll share briefly just a story from the film, of a friend of mine who is happy for me to put it on the film. So I
Oh,
presume it's
cool.
happy for me to share. But she very sadly recently had a diagnosis of breast cancer herself. And on that happening, was flooded with memories of patients she had seen with breast cancer that she genuinely thought were gone. She said to me, I genuinely didn't know those memories were there. And suddenly it was like this box opened, and all I could do was remember their words and how the room smelled. And so I suppose that just speaks to your point that, yeah, I don't think they do go away. I think they sort of mingle around for a while. And while there is need to, of course, be professional in the moment and put things aside, I think that question of how we give people space to think about those things is really important.
Well, it's kind of that is a interesting story, a very caring story actually that you shared. What I'm intrigued by is how sometimes these will come back and literally incapacitate a person, and yet others can seem to, well, they won't necessarily thrive, but can kind of move on. And I'll give you the example that I have was in my corporate experience in the past. A lot of times you're kind of advised to like leave your family problems at home. And the reason why I bring this up because that's an emotional load that you're carrying, right? And yes, you're trying to switch into your professional mode. We kind of forget though that we're emotional beings, right? Like we like to deny that unbelievably, but we are. And then I kind of see like how did we even manage to believe that that was a way, a way? And I still think it's very prevalent. I don't think it's gone away. And it brings me to, I don't know whether you're familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate out of Canada, and he was one of the first that I kind of read about. Was he was saying how we deal in the medicine world with the science part of it, but we exclude the emotional part of it, so that we treat the symptom in a, I'll say, a scientific manner, but not necessarily recognize the emotional state of the patient, which I realize the complexity that's involved with that. But I find it almost overwhelmingly stunning, Sophie, that we're still kind of at that point. Like it's like like because you know how our emotions can make us feel like just waking up in the morning. Why did like the expression like you woke up on the wrong side of the bed and nothing really happened, but that there was something that state. And to me, when you talk about this in the moral injury that undoubtedly we're going to encounter these events in our lives, we're human. um really interested how your work is trying to, first of all, identify that, bringing it forward. And I kind of have a hard time thinking that you're trying to come up with a solution, but rather a way of better dealing with it, so to speak.
Hmm.
Would that be fair? Like,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely fair. I mean, firstly, just to answer your one of your first points, I was watching a play the other day about nurses in the First World War, and it just struck me. I mean, obviously, as you know, so many people suffered post that war, particularly in terms of their mental health. But in terms of how people spoke about that at the time, generally, I mean, I feel like that war was fought with emotional suppression. You know, people went along with it. You know, many didn't have a choice. I don't mean that to minimize it, but you know, that kind of attitude that feels very British, I have to say, of, you know, keep calm and carry on was,
yes,
as you say, it was so prevalent. And I think it's really difficult for us to move away from that. And as you say, we still are, you know, having this kind of conversation about how it is difficult to open up. And like you, I find that really surprising. Um,
it's like it's entrenched within us somehow. Like I would almost go to the point of using the word epigenetic.
mm,
Like it's so
yeah.
deep in us that it's like, now maybe generationally that will shift. But to me, that there's things that science has revealed of how deep things can go within us.
Yes, I would agree. And I think that's a perfect use of that word. Um, to speak to your second question of, you know, is there a solution or am I looking for it? In some senses, yes. I don't know whether I spoke about it last year, but I'm involved in a project where we are actively trying to build a solution in terms of we've run a number of retreats, taking frontline workers out of their jobs and getting them together for 3 days and allowing the space to tell these stories. We also kind of run training events, etc. But I think that aside, my hope for the film and other projects along those lines is, as you say, less about finding a solution specifically for moral injury and more about just normalizing conversations around difficult
Mm.
emotions. So I would hate for it to become, you know, people need sort of specific mental health support because they're injured in this way, although that might be the case. But more, it's okay to talk about seeing a dead body and it feeling weird, or you know, um, so very basic, but a big mission in some ways.
I can't help but think of this as an example here is you're probably familiar with C.S. Lewis writings.
Yes.
And he wrote two books. One, well, both about pain and suffering. One was after when he had experienced it with his wife. I believe her name was Joy. Surprised by Joy, I think it was called. And he said how real this was, how difficult this was. And his first book was more of an intellectual discourse or essay about pain. And he said how different they were, like 180 degrees. There's the intellectual when you're not really in pain, but you're trying to describe something. And then when he truly experienced it. And I read that his conclusion was we're going to have pain, suffering in our lives. We're going to have, I think, in that sense of we're going to have moral injury in this life. Like we're not going to avoid it. And it wasn't he's saying like in often our world, like be happy. Like just be happy. And he said that you can't you're going to experience suffering and pain in this life. And is there a way to better deal with it rather than trying to erase it? Was kind of the point that I got from his stuff. And I can't help but listening to in how you describe this project and what your work is. I can't, like, you're not going to be able to erase this. Like, it's
Mhm.
there. How do we um, not pretend that it doesn't exist, but actually, to your point, it's okay to talk about. It's okay to, and maybe there's a way that we can ease that burden, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. I always think of it as you say, if we're always going to experience pain and suffering, but it's actually our attachments, I think, to that pain that cause more suffering. So what I mean by that is if one witnesses something difficult at work, it's often the attachment to what will people think of me if I find this hard or show emotion that I think causes more suffering in the end, than the actual thing. And again, I've got so many examples of that through the film interviews I've been doing about doctors who've broken down by a patient's bedside and then felt acutely embarrassed, and the whole department was talking about it, etc. And it's sort of those things of, it's almost like a denial of that natural need to grieve something or to process something in the moment. And yeah, I worry that yeah, it just perpetuates the pain. And as you say, we are always going to experience it. And I think that's partly due to the world we're living in. And certainly in medicine, the systems, which certainly in the UK are making it very difficult to not be morally injured for the moment.
Sure.
Um, so you're never going to completely take that away. But yes, I think all we can do is just say, let people know it's okay to say that that's difficult, to acknowledge it, whatever that looks like for them.
Well, to me, it's really it's one of those things that just it seems to be very like asking the question, where did it come from? Where did it come from that I felt I would be judged
Mm,
by um, crying at a movie, a sad scene in a movie, or crying with somebody telling me they're either both their joyful story or their tragic story. And to your point, it's almost like what's in us is overridden by what's been, I'll say, culturally given to us in the judgment area. Like I'm like that's why I said I'm intrigued by your work because, like, how did we get to feel this way? Is that our culture that, again, it comes back to, as a man or in the masculine world, this whole idea of being a mighty warrior that most of us really aren't.
mm,
But
mm,
we don't want anyone to know.
mm. I always say I think the Victorians have a lot to answer for. They were
Well,
just
okay.
generally repressed.
Don't
But yeah,
show any emotion. Like it's
yeah.
kind of like I used to talk and write a little bit about this around my background's engineering, and in that sense, nothing was emotional. Like you never made an emotional decision, and it was like I kind of believe all decisions are emotional because that we get it confused with, if I do an emotional decision, I'm just doing a cowboy decision. I'm not doing any work. It's just seat of the pants decision. And no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying we do the work all, but it's still, once you've done all the calculating, all the work that's required to figure out a problem, often the first, so how do you feel about the answer?
Absolutely. And I
Like
recently,
how is that? Like, to me, in some of your work, in the moral injury work, this has to come up a lot.
yeah, yeah. I recently saw Jacinda Ardern speak, the
Oh, okay.
Prime Minister of New Zealand, and she said something that really spoke to me. So she was talking about obviously when she'd been in power, and much of her work obviously was very emotionally draining and challenging. But she was saying that people used to say to her, like, can you do your job and still be affected, even though you're affected by it? And she said, why would I not want to be affected by what I did?
Yes.
How could I make decisions about the country during COVID and not be moved and affected? And I think, therefore, secondarily, another drive for me to do this is that I think when people cut off themselves from difficult emotions, they also cut themselves off from joy, as you say, from, you know, some of my most memorable and rewarding experiences in medicine have been sitting with patients while they die. And I am so privileged to have been a part of those journeys and moments. But if I don't open myself up a little bit to that, I don't then feel the human reward of that as well. And so, we can't have it all ways. That's what I'm trying to say. Um, and as I said, as we've said, that takes providing people with the space and environment to manage those emotions. But if you open yourself up to sadness, you also open it up to many of the positive things that come from important work and important places.
Is is there a fear we have of this emotion that that keeps us away from them? Like, and I don't know how to even describe that further, but have you encountered the sense that people are fearful of revealing that true self, so to speak, in an emotional way? Like, I can't reveal that. Like, if I show I'm vulnerable, somebody will use that later to defeat me, so to speak.
Definitely, I think so. But I think there's also a fear of what will happen if I allow myself to show some emotion. And interestingly, some of the people I've interviewed for the film have talked about that in relation to death. So they themselves have said, well, I'm afraid of dying. So how can I possibly be open to that conversation with a patient? And that's a real issue, isn't it? Because how can
Oh
you
yeah.
provide spiritual guidance, whatever you think of as that, if you're so afraid? And one doctor actually said, I feel like we make decisions sometimes based on that fear of, I'm going to keep you alive at all odds, against all odds, because I can't face the alternative. And I
Oh,
think
that's
that,
interesting.
yeah, that's a big thing to think about, I think.
That's kind of in the oath, is it not? The Hippocratic Oath, in a way, like to no matter what, sustain life, isn't it? So I'm paraphrasing it, obviously, but I read this recently because of I was making a comment around um, sustaining life in the elderly, because it comes up with the MAID here in Canada as well, and it's like, and often, like, it's not. I kind of feel it's really not my decision on whether someone else lives or not. It's out of my control. I had nothing to do with them coming into the world, so to speak, nor myself or any of us have. And when that time arrives, but when people are commenting about the quality of life, so to speak, and you just mentioned the doctor saying something to the effect of, well, what quality of life will they have in doing this? But the Hippocratic Oath kind of is fairly clear about not that being the doctor's decision, right? The doctor is to sustain life, period, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to reread it to know the actual words, but
Yes.
yeah, I mean, the first element is not doing harm, but
Yes,
secondly,
yes, yes.
yes, it is about prolonging life. But interestingly, when Hippocrates was around back in the
Mm.
day, um, it's interesting when you look at the history of medicine that the birth of sort of new medicine in ancient Greece, they were actually very because they weren't as informed or informed really at all by empirical science. There was a lot of philosophy that people brought to the practice of medicine. So
Okay, yes.
imagine there probably were more conversations around life and death, and and actually, as we've gone through history, then more towards the modern times, in some ways that's been removed, and we've
Hmm.
replaced it with, this is germ theory, this is empirical science, this is evidence based. And of course, we're
Yeah.
grateful for that in many ways.
Yeah.
But in other ways, I wonder, what have we lost by have we lost that sense of existentialism, for example, that I just think medical training could facilitate. And I think, wouldn't that be wonderful? Because it doesn't really help anyone if we try to dehumanize medicine. That doesn't really help doctors, and it certainly doesn't help patients. who still want that connection with a doctor and they want that recognition.
Well, that to me, that would be probably, I'll say here in Canada, and this is boots on the ground. This is not media. This is people I've talked to, is they actually like crave that bedside manner of a
Mm.
doctor. It's like a friend of ours is going through cancer, and the one comment was made was, um, it doesn't matter about science. She's going to keep and keep him healthy just through her telling him what she tells him. And I thought, isn't that amazing to like, and that's not everyone, right? It's like you kind of said it is the scientific approach with almost stripping away the emotional humanity part of it. And I find that like so intriguing with like, well, with AI, with our technology world, you'd think we could almost bridge that in a way to come back to it, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm switching a little bit here, Sophie, but it just kind of occurred to me like even the idea of what intelligence is about, as we become more fluent with the ability to get knowledge. I'm speaking particularly here with AI. We can literally find out almost anything with a couple of the different apps today that are available to us, and very, very quickly. It's almost like we don't have to remember anything in a way. And I sometimes wonder with that part of intelligence, will that help us to come back to this emotional part that is kind of inexplicable in many ways, right? It's like it's almost like a wing of science that's just, well, we can't figure that out, so we'll just let it go for now. Do you see something like that kind of even in a lot of your work? To me, would is kind of seeing something to that extent. Is that fair? A comment?
Yeah, I think that'd be a very positive way for AI to contribute to the world.
Yes, yes,
I mean, even in my practice where I work, we're discussing bringing in AI to record patient notes as we
yes,
speak,
yes.
which I'm hugely in favor of. And as you say, that as an impact would mean that I could spend more time talking to people, and as you say, focus on those really humanistic parts of what we do. So yes, I hope that will be part of it. I suppose, as we've talked about before, there are many parts of the modern world that take us away from each other, and sort of foster a disconnection in many ways. And I think in some ways AI can perpetuate that in other respects. But the question is, do we still want that connection? And if enough people want it, I hope that some of these tools will be used in those ways that could aid us in terms of connecting with each other, not cause more divides.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I think this is such a neat point, and I comment on this many times, but I think the pandemic, in its worldwide sense, in a sense, it's almost like another world war, in the sense of its in internationalness. But one of the things that really, to me, for me personally, became very aware. A number like of things were flowing with that, including writing and doing different things. But the having a real renewed sense of how important we are to each other, and you kind of mentioned this as you talked about it, but and the podcast has become part of that as well. Is this? I feel like I'm talking all day with people now. And it's not corporate talking in the sense of project oriented. This is um like what's going on in your life and things like that that are more on a personal basis. I'm a little almost sometimes overwhelmed by it. And it kind of I'll say I became more recognizant from our last discussion because we were talking about it in schools, right? And I think I mentioned talking circles and how like will school become not what I thought it was when I went to school as curriculum based, but more socially based. You'll be learn you'll and I for me this is weird because I just feel it's natural. Like say hello to somebody, talk. But what I've kind of become much more aware of is it's not necessarily natural. And it's something that you have to become aware of because of how much we appear to need one another. I'm kind of going on. This is kind of a mixed up question because it then steps into this alone series that I talked to you about. And what do you do to a misbehaving prisoner is you put them in solitary confinement. Now we have a show that's actually promoting the winner is the one who can stay alone the longest and survive. And I sometimes wonder, like, that's the opposite to kind of what I'm talking about in the sense of the communication. So this kind of comes back into that. I think it's very connected with the sense of moral injury
Mm.
because that is not doesn't tend to make us more open, right? It tends to close us off more.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the core emotions of moral injury is shame. So people feeling, oh, that shouldn't happen, or I was at fault, I'm at fault. And as we know, like shame is very isolating. It's not something we want to talk about. So as you mentioned, the pandemic, really a lot of moral injury arose there, as you say, because there were unnatural things that happened when it came to connection. So I read an article only yesterday about Brazilian nurses creating a sort of a human hand from filling gloves with warm water and like attaching them to a patient's hand so that they would have the sensation of a human touch. I mean, just, heartbreaking. But there was an acknowledgement in that of what is very comforting to a person. So I think the witnessing of patients dying alone, patients speaking to their family on an iPad, that was very injurious to the people, in that setting. Um, and then speaking to community and the schools and talking circles, as you say, I mean, the research for the research that there is points to things like moral injury being healed through community. So it's about me talking to you, telling you a story, and you saying, I feel that too, like that happened to me. And that instantly or fairly quickly dispels shame. You realize that you're not alone, etc. And I think that's why it is so powerful. Finally, to come to the series alone, which I am aware of. I haven't watched it, but I suppose for me, there's something different, isn't there? I suppose there is something about solitude and introspection, and I
Hmm.
think we can learn a lot about ourselves in silence and time away. And I don't think that is a negative thing
Hmm.
necessarily. But I agree with you. Yes, there is something about an increasing individualized world that is a bit different. So how our world really now focuses on personal achievement, on personal success, on even things like a lot of single person households and stuff, because it's better if you own your own place rather than like live in groups or whatever. I think yes, that can have a very negative end, and obviously a lot of people are isolated and without wanting to be. Um, but I think there can be real benefits from facilitating a way that people can spend time by themselves and learn more about themselves. But I think you need both, ideally you
So
need both.
that would be a quote from my mother, and that was balance is is
Yeah.
is like whether it be your diet or your life, because you do to your side you do need quiet time, and it's what's so weird. Even when I think of even myself this way, is I I, I was always around people for years in the corporate world, right? And you just want to get away to have time of your own, but you don't want too much of that
Right. Right.
because then you start itching to, or I do, I want to see someone. But then when we were legally bound to our houses, it's almost like, oh no, we can't go out and do that. And we're going to shut down all the places where you would go and do that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's been kind of a real, like it was a big thing when we moved out here. To meet people, I started to invite people out for coffee and simply just to have a conversation. It wasn't like there's no transaction here. Like I'm not meeting you because you can do something for me, so to speak. It's just it's a way of being able to have a communication. And I had no idea that that was even in me, Sophie. Like it's so weird.
But now look at you, you're speaking spending your day speaking to people, which
Well,
is
this is
wonderful.
what I mean. Like it's a very and it's so intriguing to hear what people are talking about to me. That's why like coming across you and the things that you were working on, and this is where I wanted to get back to your work with expeditions because who Wes Hansen, who has been on this podcast as well, was the one who introduced me to you, and it's become a big part of his expedition planning now around the teamwork, the mental health, the things that he wasn't necessarily concerned with prior to that. And I thought, okay, so now let's go and say, okay, where is Sophie at? Because you just told me before we went on that you've become the vice president of the Explorers Club or something to that effect.
Yes, the Great Britain and Ireland chapter of the Explorers Club.
So
Yeah.
can you explain a little bit of what the Explorers Club is about?
Yeah, so the Explorers Club is a international organization of adventurers, expeditioners, scientists, researchers, filmmakers, storytellers, all, I guess, with a common love for exploration. So travel with purpose, finding new things, meeting new people, making new discoveries. And, it's an intimidating space, I would say, in terms, I'm very intimidated. There's some really amazing people in it. But I think what I love most about it is the breadth and the diversity, and the passion in it. So you'll meet people who study 10 different things, but they're all passionate about that one thing. And that's, yeah, often very moving. The organization is based in New York, the main organization,
Hmm.
but there are chapters all over the world, of which the British chapter, I think, is the largest outside of the US. I think I'm correct
Oh,
in that.
really? Okay.
Um, and we put on events throughout the year, with speakers. We hold a big dinner towards the end of the year. And it's really, I think, it provides a network for people to come together and meet others who have that same slightly crazy attitude towards life, and who, it's not unusual to hear in the bar, okay, let's do an expedition to the Antarctic next year. And those kind of
Just like
ideas
that.
come from, yeah, being in that environment. So it's inspiring. But I mean, in terms of what we're talking about today, I think as an organization, they are embracing all elements of expeditions. And I've actually done some work with the Explorers Club proper around mental health, particularly in terms of like responding to incidents. And we've done a few kind of debriefs with people from the group who have been through difficult situations. So yeah, I've been really impressed at how willing they've been to have those conversations.
How does like a GP even get involved with that? Like you weren't I think you told in the last conversation that you went on a like an expedition trip in your teens, if I'm not mistaken. Is
That's
that
right.
really what gave you like the incentive to say, "Well, I want to go further with this, and maybe I can bring my medical world into this as well"?
Yeah, kind of. I'd wanted to do medicine before that, I think, but I grew up in a rural part of Yorkshire, so very much, going out on long walks with my dad at weekends, and I enjoyed being in a slightly wilder environment. But then, really well remembered, I did an expedition in the US, when I was 17, which was following the Lewis and Clark Trail,
Yeah.
across the US. And as you say, that was the first time I'd sort of slept outside properly, under the stars. And I loved that sense of freedom from just sort of living from your bag and, you know, being a bit like dirty because you're unshowered in days. And it just sort of suited me, I think. So
Uh,
yeah, it was always an ambition of mine to then become an expedition doctor, which I did, and have been lucky to do a number of expeditions as a doctor. Um, and yeah, these days I possibly do less of that and more the training around it in terms of mental health and research. But I still get a thrill from, going to these places and myself being in the wild and these environments.
well, one of the things that like we used to do portaging trips, like for a week, nothing to the call it expedition level type of thing. But I was always amazed how little you really needed to to live on. Like it's amazing to me when you get out that and like when you set up camp and you got to find a place to where it's flat enough to put a tent and where your fire's going to be and how little you actually need to actually be happy or sustain yourself in the environment, right? Compared
Absolutely.
to when I like you come home and you have like these multiple rooms and you have things that are in all of them and it's like, wow, how did I get by for a week without any of this? It was
Yeah.
just kind of a kind of an interesting picture from that side. So, switching a little bit here, what prompted you to become a I'll say become a filmmaker, but actually inspire the film you're making right now? Like what kind of got like I know you did your dissertation,
Mhm.
but doing writing a dissertation and then jumping into filmmaking, that's not just a direct linear you do this you're going to do that kind of thing. What are you like, were you always a movie fan? Did you always like the idea of that movie, that way of, shall we say, visualize or putting into visuals things? I'm not trying to answer for you, I just want to get an idea because again it's fascinating that a doctor GP does all this stuff.
Many things, I think.
You have no lack of conversation with patients.
Yeah, sadly, lack of time. Um, yeah, I have always loved film. Generally, my dad loves films, so
Okay.
from a really young age, back in the day of having VCR, we had videos
Okay.
everywhere. But I've particularly always loved documentary.
Okay.
I'm always, as you say, really moved by a story being told in that way, and the use of music, visuals, is always something I've enjoyed. So I started dabbling in filmmaking probably about 10 years ago now.
Okay.
Um, and it was during a project where I was going around the world researching mental health in different communities. And I started recording my interviews on camera. And I absolutely loved it. And I'm such a geek. I really enjoyed the kind of editing process of what am I going to put where and what if their smile lands there and how will that, and I preferred it, I think, to writing as
Okay.
a form. And I suppose, being honest, I've since then struggled a bit with that sense of imposter syndrome of, you know, I'm not really qualified to do it. Like, I'm not very good, and it's, I think that's a real it's very common for medics, and it's common for many people, but you get into medicine, you sort of get told really what you're gonna be, and, I wrote about this in my dissertation, this idea of cutting off particularly creative parts of yourself, I think, to focus on the science and the study, and so I didn't have a lot of confidence, I think, in my own ideas and my ability to just go out there and do it. So I've sort of played around for a long time, and made bits and pieces. I did a module in documentary film as part of my master's, and I created a short film. Um, but this project feels very special because it feels like, for the first time, I believe that I can make something serious, and that, that will involve, I'm sure, asking for help, which it already has. But I will do this and make it because it's really important to me. And where did that come from? Well, it came from what I was writing about, but I think at the heart of it, it comes from my own story, my own questions of why did I not talk about things that affected me early on in my career, and how did that shape me? And so I've sadly come to the conclusion that I have to be in the film a little bit. Otherwise, it's not very fair.
Well, that's very cool though. Like that's a very that makes it yours. Like
Yeah.
that to me you have your signature right on it. Like that's well now you got me really anxious to see this. Because you brought up the word creative. And I really think when I'll put it in I'll call it education system. But it seems we are almost intent, and I think this might have come from the early days of even the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of organized education, was to move the creative part of us out so that we could learn to work not in the field anymore, because to me, agriculture is a very creative world, right?
Mm.
In the farm, like you're constantly creative. It's almost like camping in many ways, and um, and move that so that you could go into this industry, this corporate, this hierarchical structure, and be taught early on to be able to participate in it, and in the process, kind of have our creative part of us almost beaten out of us, or make it so that if that's what you want to be, you're going to be on the outskirts of of society, so to speak, because we're going to make it so that you can't do very much. I do believe technology's brought a lot of that back because I think there's a lot of creativeness, like in apps and things like that. But to your point, I love when you use the word creative because to me that is a staggering part of who we are as emotional beings.
I agree, and I think in the work that I've done, as you say, it's highlighted to me the importance of being creative in terms of making sense of what we see. You know, there are so many examples in literature and music and film of, you know, stories that people have already told about difficult things that are there for us to access if that was part of our education. And then, as you say, our ability to formulate our own ideas. You know, show me a field where that isn't important. I think that's always important. But I certainly didn't know that, I think, up until quite recently.
Well, it's funny, a sport analogy to this. In Canada, North America, there was a great hockey player called Bobby Orr. He was a defenseman, and he his body couldn't keep up with his abilities to do stuff. And one of the comments he did in his autobiography was to say that in today's world of sport, which is 24/7, it's enormously competitive. The an athlete is just today's athlete is there's only athletic stuff, nutrition, all the stuff that goes with it. And he said if he was in today's world, he probably wouldn't have been successful because he was allowed to do so much creative stuff in playing because and enhance his abilities could come out to be able to skate and all those things. And I thought, I've never heard that explained that way, but how beautiful that is. And will we be able to get back and allow that? Your work to me starts to bring that back to say, we are emotional beings. Get over it. and
Definitely,
and try and
definitely.
figure out how to do that. Like to me, like you're
Yeah,
going like it's to be a doctor, I think most know there's a lot of work to do that. And you have to also be quite smart. Like those are two things that are there. And then you go out and become a filmmaker, which no matter how you look at that, that's a creative pursuit. Like 95%, a huge part of it. Like as you get into it, like you said, you're measuring sound, you're measuring all the things. Um, I grew up, or we have a similar family. It sounds like you grew up in. We watched a lot of movies. We are all big movie kind of buffs because to me that visual part helps to explain so much. It's very difficult to get in reading even. So it's But anyway, to your point about that, like, was it through this work that you recognized that creative part, or did you know about it and were kind of suppressing it so you could get through medical school, so to speak?
yeah, good question. I was very creative as a child,
Hmm.
interestingly. I did a lot of drama and music, dance, and then I went to medical school. As I say, I never consciously thought I'm not going to be that anymore, but I think just with time, etc., a lot of that fell away. And it was only maybe a couple of years ago where I was feeling quite burnt out from doing a lot of work with burnt out people. Which I loved, but I was getting to feeling almost a little bit resentful of it at times, which was horrible. And I couldn't work out why, because I was thinking I'm really passionate about this, and so I decided I would just do something really playful. And I'd been reading this book about tapping into what you enjoyed as a child and like going from there. So I took an acting class. I started doing an acting class about 2 years
Wow.
ago. Just something else to throw in. and and it was just absolutely revelatory to me. I suddenly felt that I'd had all these years where I hadn't been expressing that part. And that's not to say like I'm an amazing actress or anything. It's just that it felt like a very different thing to my other areas of work. And so I've since then continued that. I now really prioritize that. And interestingly, through that, my focus work wise has become more about how the arts and health kind of intersect. And I'm hoping to feature some of that in the film as well.
Well, you'll know this quote. This came from Winston Churchill, but to your point, I think his arts minister came to him at one point, and they were looking for money for the war, like because like it was scarce, and they said, "Well, we could take money out of the arts council or the arts world." And Churchill replied to him, "But I thought that's why we were fighting this war."
Mm.
And I was going to say, like, that to me so represented the idea of how important art is to us in that world. So have you then in your acting, have you performed and had to do as part of that, perform in an audience and
Yeah, we've done a few small performances as part of the classes. And what's really interesting is, I've not in an arrogant way at all, but I've become quite well versed at giving talks on my research topic or, these kind of things. And I feel reasonably okay doing that. But when I got on stage, I was absolutely terrified, and it just felt like so exposing,
oh,
um, and so vulnerable. And yeah, and that felt really wonderful. It felt like I guess showing a different side of myself. It's been very, I don't want to overuse the word, but it's been very healing, I think, in
oh yeah.
terms of maybe being quite disconnected in the past.
So
Yeah.
when you finished a performance, did you feel like exploding? Like was it like just
Oh, I just felt elated. Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing feeling.
It is, and it's that feeling of getting on stage and being initially nervous, and then I find the words just come to you, and you sort of transcend, and it's just an amazing feeling. And but what felt very profound about it was the feeling felt very authentic, like it was,
Mm,
yeah, this is me, and I think the arts, like singing, for example, I know is a great way that people connect to themselves, but interestingly, often something that people feel very self-conscious about because
yes.
it does feel
It
exposing.
it's you. Like
It's you, like there's no way of hiding it.
you can't get much more vulnerable to me than that. Like
Right.
that's a huge thing to kind of take over. So I'm going to ask you a line here because I'm beginning to feel that if you're not uncomfortable in this life, we're not doing it right. And your example here is like you were like stepping up on stage. Like, well, I think there's a saying about even public speaking, right? Like people would rather be dead than be public speaking, as an example, right? And it's like, but you did it, like you finish, you kind of go and do it. But to say and leading up to it was probably enormously discomfortable too, uncomfortable too, right? So coming back to this point of, in a way, this moral injury and being able to come forward with it, that's uncomfortable.
Yes,
It's
yes,
almost comfortable to not say anything.
yes.
And that's kind of why, like, I'm asking, like, this is one of the things in the conversations I've had. I said, like, I'm beginning to think that if we're not uncomfortable, we're not doing this thing right.
I totally agree. And I think that's something that actually performance can teach us, that it can make us more comfortable in that space. And I think it's had an effect on how I have conversations in my personal life. But
Really,
yeah, I think so. I think it's enabled me to feel and express emotion on stage that I've then connected to and sort of said out loud. And I think you're right. I think discomfort is a really important thing to feel. I think that's how, without being tried, I think that's how we grow. through those moments. I'm not one for people doing something they don't want to do repeatedly, but I think you're absolutely right. If you're always comfortable, I would wonder, yeah, where are you stretching yourself in terms of your own growth? And I think that's different for everybody. That might be
Oh,
quite Everest, or it might
absolutely.
be getting on stage, or as you say, everyone has their own fear. But the goal, as you say, is to get people more comfortable just in this, in being honest with each other. And sadly, as you say, that's often what people find the hardest.
It's so I mean I said this earlier on, and it's a question again for you is why are we like where does it come from that we're in such denial over being these emotional beings that we are? Like I just it's odd to me. There's a fulfillment to me that comes with almost being vulnerable. Like kind of speaking out and not trying to say hi. No, I again I'm sure there's lots of things that I have that I'm uncomfortable talking about too, but it's like, it's a practice. Like you kind of have to keep doing it, but as you keep doing it, it just seems to be, well, I feel like I'm fulfilling something that wasn't there before.
I think it's definitely a practice. I think that's a really good way of describing it, because it is a muscle that needs to be worked in the same way, like walking or running. And
Mhm.
while you're practicing it, it does feel uncomfortable. I think, I mean, there's so many answers to that question, isn't there, of why we are the way we are.
Yes, absolutely.
I think a lot of it is our conditioning. It's growing up thinking that who we are is dependent on what others think and say, and I think as one gets older you lose a bit of that organically, but it's a
Mm.
shame that it can take time. um but really, our fear of judgment, as I say, I think kind of comes from that. What will it mean if I really show myself? And it keeps people hidden for years. Interestingly, the working title of my film is A Hidden Curriculum, which is about, it's a little bit made me smile when you were talking about curriculums in schools, maybe
Oh, yes.
illustrating socializing. And I'm almost saying with this that there's this unspoken curriculum of silence, in medicine. And, if we could flip that to there's this curriculum of sharing with each other, then just imagine what the world would look like.
I just I think it would be such a dramatic thing that and I don't think it'll be a sudden thing, but I my hope is again, and especially when I'm talking with people like yourself, I just get super hopeful for the human race, right? It's just like we're in good hands, man. It's stunning to me when I think about it because you'll get in corners and whether people are listening to the news or whatever, it's like everything's going down the tubes kind of thing, and you're going, yeah, but when I step outside my door, nothing's happening like that. Like it's really weird to me. And so
Yeah.
it's like um there's that thing that we're locked inside, we're watching technology, whether it be TV, screens or whatever, but the world I step outside into is not the same one. It like one's very much a storyline that's quite distorted from what I'm experiencing when I walk out the door. So when you say your film's called The Hidden Curriculum, wow, that is it is because I think technology is really changing that idea. Like when I said to you about redefining the idea of intelligence. So the example I had given to people is people who have the ability to now you're in acting, the ability to remember lines or they can read like a poem and quote it very quickly or whatever it might be. It could be a series of information and you will go, wow, that is really smart that they can do that. They're very intelligent. And yet, literally today, we carry around information that we can find out instantaneously on our phone. And it's not going to get worse, it's only going to get better. So, how will we define what that intelligent factor is? Because it'll no longer be great that you can remember who won the whatever it might be in 1935, right? Like,
Mm.
because you'll be able to look it up instantly. And I
Yeah.
think we credit a lot today with people's memory. Oh, you must be smart because you can remember all this. I would think even in med school, it's stuff you have to remember. Like it's overwhelming. But now, like you can just find it out just so quickly, and it's astounding to me. That's why I said curriculum to me is that going to shift because of
Yeah, it's really interesting question, isn't it? Of how will our perceptions or our framing of intelligence shift? I was just talking with some friends over the weekend. I was with some university friends about being a doctor and the art that we all pick up of when someone walks in the room, being able to say, this person's sick or this person's not sick. And we were smiling about that and, how you just grow that as and it comes from, a sense of, not like a sixth sense, it's based on experience. But I wonder whether, as you say, as AI and tech takes over, maybe that recall of drugs names or whatever, just thinking about it in a medical setting for a moment, whether that real like human attunement to things will become increasingly special, as I think it should be. Because I do think that is something that AI can't do.
yes,
It cannot live all the experiences that you have. And there's something about being in a room with somebody, there's something about touch, about picking up on body signals, etc., that I think is very unique to humans.
yes,
Um, but you're right, it would skew then what we have traditionally thought of as someone being intelligent. And I think we see that, don't we, in ever now used phrase emotional intelligence, etc. Like
yes,
I doubt
yes.
that was even said like 50 years
True enough. True enough. But it is one of those things. And when you just what you said about um, touch, um, when you put touch combined with um, speaking not as a person would to kindly to another person without the you mentioned the reciting the drugs, the medications, the procedures, what that would just do to a patient, right? Like, and again, I'm not here trying to say like, well, just put your hands on them and they will heal. I'm not. That is not what I'm alluding to here at all. But I'm saying that there's something within our human bodies as well that's extremely powerful. That that depending on what your mental state is, makes worse or better.
hmm
And I think that's been demonstrated even with science.
Yeah,
And like, if you could take that part of humanity into not just medicine, but so many things, it would
absolutely.
just, to me, it would just change enormously well, it comes back, I think, almost to your title of your film, The Hidden Curriculum. That's like, I remember that one. So do you have any idea like how long this will be before you'll release it?
Well, it was funny. I was talking to a friend of mine today who's a filmmaker, and he's very experienced filmmaker, and he was giving me some guidance. And he was like, when I worked at the BBC, we would sometimes make documentary films in 12 weeks, like the whole process. But that was like incredibly intense.
No kidding.
Don't have any ambition to be that quick. But he did give me some really good advice that sometimes we can prepare and prepare and prepare and not just get on with the process. And I've probably been doing that a little bit. So he was like, get going. So I don't know. I think
Interesting.
towards the end of the year, I would like to be filming properly, have like gathered a bit of a team, and then we'll see. But I've put a lot of thought into it, and I'm enjoying the thought. But I think yeah, it's time to get on with the race.
So did your acting play a role in deciding to be in the film yourself?
I don't think the acting played a role in that. I think it was the sense that I felt it was only fair in some ways to share my story when I was asking other people to.
Okay.
And it also, yeah, it meant a lot to me to write about my own story in my dissertation. And so I kind of thought I would like to tell it and I would like to maybe not at all like make it about me, but
Mhm.
I think it gives meaning behind why you've done it. right?
Well, for sure it does.
Why you
Absolutely.
are the person to make that film. And so, yeah, I feel comfortable in doing that.
It's interesting because I think when you create something of your own, you have yourself marked on it, whether you like it or not.
Mhm.
And I think it's kind of cool how you've now more intentionally decided to put a part of you in the film as well. Like I think that's it's one of those things that when you see films and they have a cameo of the director in it,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
something that's special about that and it fits, right? And I mean I'm talking about not a documentary so much as like a film, but it's just like M. Night Shyamalan. He always has a cameo in his films, right? And it's
Okay.
kind of fun
Yeah.
as a viewer to say, that's him.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Or you might hear their voice off camera or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's extremely thing. The other thing that this all reminds me of is your famous band from the UK, Queen.
Yeah.
And why I'm mentioning this is because you've mentioned this creative spirit. Each one of those individuals were all professional, according to the legend, right? One was an electrician. One was Brian May is recognized as an astrophysicist, I think. Deacon wasn't he a dentist, or Roger Taylor was the dentist? And I didn't realize any of that. Like, of course, Freddie Mercury was Freddie Mercury. I mean,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
probably wouldn't have heard of Queen very much if it wasn't for the late Freddie Mercury. But I was astonished that they were all like technically could have gone the academic world into the corporate thing, and yet they decided. And I often wonder, like, how did they make that decision, or was it just the way it went? Things fell together.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And now
don't know.
you're kind of doing that.
Really. And it's interesting, since I've started looking at a bit of the history of medicine, I found all these famous figures who, so John Keats, for example, was also a doctor,
I did
and
not know
then
that.
gave up medicine to pursue his poetry. Sadly, died
Really?
very young. But there's this really nice tradition, I think, of people stepping into multiple fields generally, but particularly around medicine. I think it often does attract people who have a human interest in some other way. And again, that's why my agenda, I think, is to challenge the way training tries to like shove that out of you. I think, I think me being a filmmaker in some senses will make me a better clinician. It gives
No
you
doubt about it.
bow, and I'm a believer in that. Yeah.
And thinking of all the different things that you'll be able to share with patients above and beyond just the clinical part of the of their condition, so to speak, right? I think in the last one, because it was we had talked about the pandemic, you said many you were finding wanted to talk. They would come in and have you look at their elbow, and that would be 30 seconds. And then for the next 5 minutes, they just wanted to converse. And I thought, I think that's a real thing. Like, I think it's a real kind of what we are, right? And especially when it's reflected, like when you're talking to someone, you feel like they're listening.
Mm,
They're not just in their reading a book while they're conversing with you. There's a general interest in your well-being. I think there's something that people feed off with that. And I'm going to guess you're finding that with your interviews for the documentary as well.
yeah, I think you're right. I think it's sort of being seen, isn't it, and recognized. And I think you're right in that space between doctor and patient. It's a really special moment for that, particularly perhaps for people who don't have a lot of that in the rest of their life.
Hmm.
It is 10, 15 minutes of this is me and I'm first in this conversation. But yeah, I mean, wonderfully, as you say, a lot of the interviews I've done, people have said afterwards that it was quite cathartic just to tell the stories. And, as it is for me talking to you, for example, I think, and that's also why I love film. It does so many jobs. So it shares someone's story with an audience, but the process of being on camera can be really special for people. It allows them maybe to show sides of themselves that they wouldn't feel comfortable in ordinary
Right.
conversation. So Yeah, I really love that part of it as well, and I do see that in people. Yeah, some people are nervous on camera, but when they get into it, I think most people have a story to tell and enjoy
And
that.
you'll have a record of where you were at this point in time in your life to be able to kind of look back, and who knows where that's going to take you.
Yeah, and I recently actually looked back on some of the footage that I recorded 10 years ago when I was
Oh, wow.
doing this project with mental health. And I was actually in the US for some time in California. And, to be honest, Doug, I didn't know what I was doing with this camera, like it was all wasn't great quality. But I looked at the image of me talking to, there was a particular couple who I became quite close to. And I just was taken back to feeling that connection in the room. It was just there was something so wonderful about it, being let into that space and them trusting me, I guess, with their stories. I just got such a buzz out of even just watching it again. So yeah, it's
There's something about getting that, and I'm hesitant with the word genuine or authentic, but we feel it somehow or other when it's captured even on celluloid. There's something about that's real. I might have said this the last time because it's one of the things that I think is ironic actually, but when we try to be authentic, we become inauthentic.
you're right. Yeah, yeah,
And I have to be careful where I use that because some people don't quite but I'm saying it's like when we're trying to be who we are, it's like we become not who we are,
yeah, yeah. It
which is
becomes an
kind of
extra persona, doesn't it, of being real.
it is such an interesting thing for sure. So one, I was going to say, we're kind of coming to, I think, where it'd be a good time to close. But do you have another expedition or anything like that coming up that you're going to be participating in as well? I mean, in addition into your clinical work as a doctor.
I don't have a traditional expedition coming up, but I've got a few things on the calendar. I'm heading out to Morocco first thing next year to present with a great friend of mine who's a doctor in the US, and he's of American Indian heritage, and he practices both as a sort of native healer and Western medic, and someone I deeply admire and respect. So I will be presenting with him on the
Oh
topic of
wow!
traditional and modern medicine kind of coming together. And we'll obviously spend a little bit of time in Morocco around that.
Is that in connection with anything particular? Like, is that an organization or?
Yeah, it's a social psychiatry conference. So it's looking at, holistic, more alternative approaches, I guess, to mental health than the kind of strict medical model.
Oh, that's
But there'll be
really
a
cool.
panel of a few of us. Yeah, and then before then, doing a lot of expedition training actually in a few weeks' time. But no big trips planned at the moment. We'll see what 2026 brings.
So you have a film that you're working on. Do you have a website that people like if they wanted to find out more about what Dr. Sophie Redlin is up to? Because no doubt in another year there'll be a lot of other things that are kind of going on. Do you have a website that people can connect you with?
I do. I've actually just updated it. SophieRedlin.com, but I can give you the details afterwards as
Yeah,
well.
I was going to say I'll include it in the comments for the podcast, but it's so as we get to this point, Sophie, we've talked a lot of different things. This has been for me, I almost feel selfish doing this because these are so much fun for me to do and to get to learn someone that I probably would never meet in a normal sort of set of circumstances. I do hope to meet you one day. Morocco would be kind of cool,
Same
but
for me, yeah.
anything final that you would like to wrap up with from our discussion today that we haven't maybe covered or thoughts in your mind?
Guess I'm struck by how over 2 episodes we've covered a lot of topics, but they all come to the heart of just what you said earlier, that we're emotional beings, get over it. And I think, whatever we talk about, it comes back to that. And maybe that's because it's you and me talking, but for me, that just lies at the heart of everything. So yeah, I think I'm really hopeful too that we're having these kind of conversations and it's very complicated, but it's also very simple, and that's the message I would leave you with.
In many ways, that you just said it. Like it is complicated. We're very complicated. We're so complicated that we actually can't create very much as far as what's living.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, it's as simple as saying hello.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with that, I'm going to say goodbye this time. I was going to say thank you for joining us in this fascinating conversation again with Dr. Sophie Redlin. I hope she'll come back again, maybe after Morocco next year. It'll be fascinating to see what goes on with her film. Maybe come back and talk about the film when it comes out. Anyway, with that, I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel, Better Than Not. As you can tell, we've got lots of great guests, and hopefully we can continue to do that. And with that, Sophie, if you could stay on for a minute, I was going to say I'll bid you farewell and thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.